Transparency is always a hot topic. I think that, and transparency is just one of these words with like no real definition. what the what does transparency actually mean? Um, I think that it's up to each credential owner and provider to figure out exactly what they want to be transparent about. I think that there are certain things that are not necessarily disputed, right? Like you can tell your candidates how many exams an item has. You can tell your candidates how many, uh, uh, how long they have to take the test, right? Help them just understand the process and experience that they'll go through so that they can have that exposure. Um, but then there are some things I think that people are or organizations are having conversations about. I think that it's also okay for organizations to have conversations, right? But one of those things, for instance, is like whether your job analysis should be published and open and available for candidates to view. Um, I think it should. I certainly have seen organizations, uh, many organizations publish the results of their practice analysis. I think that it goes a long way in the spirit of transparency for candidates to be able to see that data and understand that it wasn't just some crazy psychometrician in the back corner writing these test questions, but that there was a process um, where practitioners in their industry, right, the society as a whole, the association actually came together to ferret through all this material and figure out what a qualified response is versus a non-qualified response. So I think that that's particularly helpful. Um, the other kind of data that I've seen more recently people start to disclose are the pass rates.
Mm.
Um, I think that has, always been controversial in the past um, for a number of reasons. Um, some organizations, I know at least of a couple organizations that have actually posted their pass rates by ethnicity, um, which of course nobody wanted to do because they didn't want to get sued. I mean, at the end of the day, right? Organizations are still looking to protect themselves. Um, so they're more hesitant to post data that they think will make them vulnerable. But I think that all of it is really helpful. Even if you're just posting your pass rates um, by the average, right, without the demographic breakdown, it's helpful. It's helpful for people to see and understand the variance there. Um, okay, and I talked about updating exam content. Exam content, I would say, in a lot of organizations is updated on an annual basis. Uh, some folks are, updating it more frequently or less frequently. a lot of folks doing it less frequently. Um, but I think an annual update is a good benchmark, good industry benchmark. To bring your item writing committee or your item review committee together to look at some of the test questions and make sure everything is still performing up to standard. The big psychometric principles that you'll hear about when you speak to your psychometric vendor or your internal psychometricians is reliability and validity. These are the hallmarks of testing. We're always going to talk about reliability and validity because it's what validity is what anchors the assessment. Validity is what makes the test real, and reliability, just like the word says, is what we are relying on to, allow us to understand that the test is working the same way each time, or at least similarly enough each time that we can rely on it to predict with a certain level of accuracy, with the same level of accuracy each time. So you'll hear your psychometric vendors talk about all kinds of statistical processes that we use to measure those things um, on an ongoing basis, on an ongoing basis and ad nauseum. Um, so psychometric properties, validity is making sure that your test is real, right? Is your test measuring the thing that we are saying that it's measuring? There are lots of different types of validity that we classify and quantify, and we measure it in a number of different ways. Sometimes a test psychometrically will be more valid or will present as more valid than it looks on its face, um, which is a property that we refer to as face validity. But there are all kinds of different types of validity, and we're measuring them at all times to make sure that your test is doing what it's supposed to be doing and not just measuring people's test taking ability, which is a huge problem, right? A lot of tests, there's a certain amount of testing that is just measuring your candidate's ability to take a test.
Mhm.
But you want your test to be measuring the candidate's acumen in whatever you're actually trying to measure. Norm centered scoring is here. This, I think, goes together with a construct that my colleague and I were talking about, um, like banding as well. These are methods of allowing people to be scored alongside groups that are similar to them and that are likely to have similar performance. So the field of testing overall has gotten into generalizability, and it talks a lot about, oh, it's got to be generalizable and it's going to apply to the entire society. There's nothing on this earth that applies to the entire society.
Mhm.
So it's just it's not feasible to think that one metric is going to be the same for everybody that takes your test. So the idea around norm-centered scoring, and banding, which I don't isn't included here, but the idea around both of them is that you can put people together and score them in populations that look more like them. To give you an example, I was speaking to a colleague the other day from Florida, and I said, well, being from New York, right, my dialect is going to be different from your dialect. It might seem, right, fairly simple or salient, but those things might make us respond to test questions even within the same language family, right? Because we all speak English and different types of English, but they might make us respond to test questions and interpret English slightly differently. Another, some of the other differences that we spoke about is just the fact that we have different education levels, right? Many of us working in the field of industrial organizational psychology or testing and measurement are going to be at the master's level or the PhD level. Most of the people taking tests are not going to be at that education level. So people who are at higher education levels should be scored in groups with other people who have similar education levels, and people with lower education levels should be scored in groups of people, again, that have similar education levels to them. And I think that this can really help to get closer to the true score for your applicants, whomever they may be. We had another example of that where we did some norm-centered scoring for, this was a population, I think that was in Canada, and so they had the different populations, they had more of an ethnic breakdown. Um, so they had, uh, in addition to some of the general categories that we have, like identifying as Black or identifying as white, they also had some Native populations that they wanted to include in their norm-centered scoring, so we included that breakdown as well. Um, so yeah, I'm a fan. I'm a fan. Norm-centered scoring is it kind of controversial? I don't know. People, I don't know. I hope. I think that there are some people who are not into norm-centered scoring or who are not into banding. Um, but what I ultimately hope, and we talked about technology a little bit early on, is that we could start to use technology, right? The big talk is about artificial intelligence. So maybe it's artificial intelligence that we can use to actually create smaller and smaller bands or smaller and smaller norms so that people can be scored more tightly with groups that identify the same way that they do. And I think that that helps us get so much more accurate in terms of being able to measure people's true performance without the noise of socioeconomics and education, right? Parsing through all of that and being able to score people with a group that's similar to them, I think is going to make a big difference. We've got some other stuff on here. Bias, there are lots of different metrics that are used to measure bias. I encourage you, we were talking earlier about PSYOP LEC conference, which is coming up. We've got a dope session within the fairness block, and we'll talk a lot about metrics and tools that you can use to assess bias in your exam. So that's those dates are October 4th to October 5th. Those sessions will be in Philadelphia, so please join us. Um, parameter drift. So parameter drift is like when you've got a test been performing for a really long time, you want to start to be able to measure that test lengthwise to make sure that it's been measuring the same thing that it was measuring from the start, basically, to make sure that test questions haven't gone astray. Parameter drift also just measures items that have been exposure. I think it's also more so a metric of item exposure. And then test equating, particularly now that most of us are moving to some kind of online or computer-based testing format. You want to make sure that if your assessment is cranking out multiple forms, that you're still working to equate those forms on the back end to make sure that they're fairly equivalent or they're performing in an equivalent nature upon administration. So we talked a little bit about validity, reliability, um, difficulty level, difficulty level, difficulty level. So difficulty level comes in so many different scales, right? You can make your own scale for difficulty level, and nobody wants to disclose their difficulty level scale. I would say, on average, let's say that you use some kind of 4-point scale to assess difficulty level for your exam or your assessment. I don't want to use, I'll just say one. One means this is actually in the reverse. So I was trying to, I'll use the decimals or else I'm going to get confused. Okay. Because we use probability also to measure difficulty level. And so if 50% of the people responding to your test questions are getting them right and 50% are getting them wrong, then your difficulty level is 0.5, right? And so you can choose 4 points literally on a scale between 1 and point 0, and you can use those 4 points to predict difficulty level for your items when you're developing them. And then you're literally just measuring the actual difficulty level as people respond to those items. So that's difficulty level, basically. It's your response percentage. How many people are getting this test question correct and how many people are getting them incorrect? Discrimination is another awkward term that we use, but the purpose of an item or any test question, and I don't know where the word item came from, but we refer to test questions as test items. The purpose of any test question is to discriminate between candidates who are qualified and candidates who are not qualified. So we measure discrimination with a lot of other numbers, but that's what that term in general means. Is when you're discriminating between qualified and not qualified candidates. And then distractor analysis. So these are item level psychometric constructs. Your assessment will be validated at an item level with each individual test question, and then also validated at a test level with the test statistics as a whole. So these principles that are mentioned here talk about statistics at the item level, but distractor analysis for some reason was always the most fun part of test development. And maybe it's a part that can sometimes get overlooked. Your distractors are a part of your test. And so you really want to be making sure that your distractors are plausible. And you want to be looking at your distractors to make sure that people are responding to them um, in somewhat equivalent rates, right? If you've got distractors and the response rate on your distractors is 0%, then it's like, what is that distractor doing to contribute to item discrimination, right? It's not contributing if nobody's picking it. So change it, do something. You probably have 3 distractors. There isn't a whole lot of evidence to say that more or less distractors is 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 is, is better or worse. So I think generally what we recommend is have as many plausible distractors as makes sense. So if it makes sense to have a 6 response choice question because there are 5 plausible distractors and they all make sense, then so be it. Most of us are working with working with items that have 4 response choices. Because I think, quite frankly, our infrastructure is designed to do that. Now you have newer testing software that can handle lots of different types of items, right? Not just for response choice, but 6 response choice, check all that apply, geographic hotspots, right? There are lots of different item types out there that you can be using, and that might actually be more applicable to the content that you're testing. You just got to get a software that can accommodate those item types. And I think it's worth it, you know, especially if there's like some spatial reasoning or something that your candidates have to do in the actual course of doing their work. If you're just using multiple choice and you're kind of shorting them. So item analysis. So this is kind of what I said a couple minutes ago. Basically, you've got 2 different levels of test analysis. You've got your item level analysis where we're looking at the actual individual test questions. So look at how they perform. And then you've got your test level analysis where you're looking at the entire assessment as a whole to look at how that assessment is performing. And it's your item level, and it's both that you should be conducting at least on an annual basis. But you have software now that will go a great long way in helping you to identify flags even before you move each question to be reviewed by your item writing committee. So it might be helpful for you to update your test software. It's not if it's not already doing this, but it should be keeping track of these item statistics in a way that it prompts you or flags you if there's a statistic that's moving outside of the criteria you created for your test. Um, cool. Thoughts, comments, questions?